Chat, let's talk about taunt. So in FGO, taunt's a really weird thing. It is a wholly unique type of effect. Taunting is how you can direct enemy attacks towards one of your people, or you can be basically directed towards a singular enemy. So where you'll encounter it probably the most is with an enemy using a taunt as either part of their kit or as, say, for instance, a break bar or fight mechanic type of effect. When this happens, you are faced with a couple of choices of how you can handle it. Obviously, you can just go into it and just say it is what it is. Or you can try to say, I'm gonna try to AoE around it. Now, interestingly enough, you can still switch what your target is when it happens on an enemy. But even if you try to switch your target, let's say you want to apply a skill to something else, it will still default back to the taunted target. So you need to be very careful with things like that. Thinking oh yeah, I can just go after that one enemy, even though I'm taunted, I'm not going to be attacking, I'm just applying a debuff to them or something like that. No, it'll still go on the taunted target. So you have to be very, very careful. When it comes to enemies attacking you, though, they unfortunately do not have to play by the same rule of thumb. And the way that it works is enemies have an action economy. Usually that action economy is 3 actions. However, there are 2 exceptions to this. One is in certain circumstances, depending on the enemy type, if you are down to a single enemy, they might only get 2 actions per turn instead of 3. The other one, and this one is far rarer, is that occasionally you will encounter a fight where an enemy can get 4 actions. This very rarely happens in FGO. Almost always enemies are capped at 3, but I have noticed it at times and it gets really funky when it does happen. So basically, the other thing to not confuse yourself with is that you will have enemies that actually have say a break bar effect, which applies numerous things, and then there are 3 actions. That's not what we're talking about. There are times where enemies do have 4 actions, which is very, like I said, rare. At least with regards to taunt is something that each and every one of you needs to know about. It is something that you're going to come up against a lot, and it's something that you yourself should learn to abuse, because taunting actually works really well as a gimmick for yourself to get through some of the fights that I think people would consider to be the game's most difficult. Being able to direct enemies towards a singular one of your allies can be very useful, because it can keep pressure off of some of your best damage dealers or supports. So people will employ taunt by multiple means, and there are many ways that you can get taunt. However, they are somewhat limited. Currently, at this point in time, there are only 4 craft essences in the entire game, and 3 of those craft essences came out in the first 6 months of the game. All of the 4 craft essences, however, are limited, and they don't often receive rerun banners. In fact, JP just announced Gouda Gouda, so people are hopeful that the new Gouda Gouda event will bring back Gouda Gouda Poster Girl, which is kind of one of the more sought after ones due to its nice attack up effect. It can be very useful. At the same time, though, it depends on what you're looking for in a taunt C as to whether or not a taunt C is good. Because you do have certain things like on Gouda Gouda Poster Girl here where you have scaling HP. So a lot of the times you don't want extra HP on a taunt, you want the person to die. And the reason for this is because of something that is known as the taunt glitch, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But understand that there's a point at which your strategy may revolve around getting the target unit killed in one turn, and then rotating a new person in that may also have another taunt effect. So basically, each one of these Cs can be really valuable because it can allow you to put it on somebody that is a, say, support, have them come in, get rotated in, pop all of their skills, and then die and rotate in for maybe yet another support or another like damage dealer or something like that. So the taunt Cs are really valuable because it allows you to have taunt on a unit that wouldn't normally have it. Similarly, you also have ones like Grand New Year here that can grant invincibility for one turn. This one is arguably one of the worst ones depending on how you want to treat it because it's also HP scaling. This is designed not to get a unit killed. So therein lies the issue, because it's designed to give it instead invincibility for that turn so that you can't necessarily get that unit actually killed. But again, this could be useful even still in a set of circumstances where maybe the unit rotates in, maybe they have it just on turn one, it just depends. But maybe you're not worried so much about getting the unit killed as you are just surviving certain like effects or onslaughts of attacks, or you maybe just want to direct an enemy's ire and skills and debuffs all towards one unit. So there are still reasons you might want something like this. Outrage is probably the game's most accessible taunt C. I actually have a video talking about this. You guys can get this on NA from the the Chaldea Boys 2019 redemption in the Rare Prism shop. If you go in there and buy the 2019 Chaldea Boys, it'll allow you to pick one craft essence from that event for free, and Outrage is one of them. On JP, that would be the 2017 version, in case you guys are playing on that server. So this is a really easy way to get one copy of a taunt C, and it's the one that I recommend people spend their rare prisms on first whenever they get them in FGO. And the reason why is because this is such a valuable commodity for certain challenge operations. And again, it's just going to be really useful to you at some point down the stretch. Now, with regards to this is not the only way to get taunt. Currently, as we make this video, no mystic codes in the game have taunt. That is what that is. But there are numerous active skills that you can get. And again, taunt is considered a defensive skill, so let that kind of float in through your mind as to understanding that defensive skills can get purged by certain people's NPs. So if you were maybe trying to count on that in order to direct someone away from something else, it's something you need to be careful with. But basically, there are numerous forms of taunt via active skill. There is taunting basically yourself. There is taunting one ally. There is taunting the party except yourself. And there is taunting enemies. Only one person has the ability to taunt enemies. That is basically Osaka Hime. What does that mean? Well, that means you're putting a taunt on the enemy to effectively taunt yourself, which is really weird. But I guess you could abuse that to some way, shape, or form. But still, interesting nonetheless. The most common type is going to be self-taunts. These are used a lot by tanks. There are a ton of them in the game, basically. The one ally ones, these are what I like to refer to as scapegoat, because Emmy Assassin is the first person in the game that really had this. And this is where you can put taunt on another one of your allies, so it's a targeted skill. And then the party-wide ones, except self, are usually going to be things like Odysseus and Miss Crane, who can basically say, hey, you have to attack anybody but me, or anyone but my target. So they are unique in that regard. Now, taunts have percentages, and to understand this, that percentage value determines the likelihood of that unit getting attacked. And you might be thinking like, okay, but if you put a taunt on, you as the player have to attack like the enemy that is taunting you. So what am I talking about? What I'm talking about here specifically is if you have multiple taunts. If you have multiple taunts, the value, the again, scaling of the like gravity of the taunt is what is going to determine which unit gets attacked. It is significant for that reason. But in every other scenario, you're really not going to care, because the difference between a taunt of 100% value and a taunt of 500% value doesn't really matter. As long as it's the only taunt on, you still have to attack that target. The reason this can be a little bit more abusable for enemies is because, again, as we mentioned, they have action economy. So an enemy doesn't technically have to attack you. They can waste their actions actually by just popping skills. This can be kind of frustrating if you're counting on it, and it definitely can still have some RNG element to any sort of run that you're trying to do, but it is something to understand that can occur, just so that you guys don't get stuck in the mindset of thinking like, oh, they have to attack now, I've won. Well, not always. Sometimes the enemies can do interesting things to get around that. So, but let's start to talk about FGO's taunt behavior overall. So we're going to assume that enemies have 3 actions, because this is the normal sort of scenario that you can see. So for normal taunt scenarios, this is going to be a taunt scenario where you have a unit that has taunt on them. Okay? So in that regard, you're going to see basically the enemy action. The first action can basically either attack and not kill the target and just keep going into it until they do, or they can attack and kill the target. If they kill the target with their first action, the enemy will use no other actions. That is what we refer to as the taunt glitch. At this point, we're pretty sure it's not actually a glitch. It's an intended bug, I guess you could say. That is to say, the devs definitely know about it, and they've just chose to leave it in because it's an interesting mechanic. So this is what we mean when we say that taunting can be really valuable and really abusable, because you can limit an enemy's actions by getting them to attack a taunted target, particularly by killing them. They might not take additional actions. Same thing if you maybe look at it from the perspective of the party rotation that we talked about before. It can be really useful to you depending on what you're trying to do. In taunt scenario number 2, you can have 2 of your allies taunting. This could be done by virtue of maybe an enemy putting a taunt on you while you also have a taunt, or maybe you have 2 characters that can apply taunts, or maybe you have one of those party-wide taunters that we've mentioned before. In this case, the enemy can take its first action and it will kill the first taunt, but you won't get the glitch. And the reason why is because there's still another valid target. Part of the reason this happens is because there is an order of operations, and we'll explain that in a second. But basically, because of this, the enemy's second action will then go against the second enemy and then potentially kill that one. Then in that scenario, you would not have a third action taken, so only the third action would get skipped. But this also does rely on the possibility of the enemy killing your taunted target with one hit, or one action really. If they don't, then all of their actions will get used, but the effect will, I guess, still be the same, depending. In scenario number 3, you can have 2 taunt units, but basically, just like we mentioned before, the first attack doesn't kill. Then basically they can end up having variance as to which one they hit. So this is where those percentages that we mentioned before came into play. If, say, one of your taunts has 300% weight and the other taunt has 500% weight, the 500% weight one is more likely to get hit. When there's 2 taunted targets, the enemy can alternate between randomly. And technically, the weight is what would determine the likelihood of an attack falling on one character or the other. You'll notice this too if this ever happens to you as the player, where there's multiple taunts on multiple enemies for you. Then you'll notice sometimes your attacks also branch around, and that gets really weird because there's seemingly a randomness to it, and your attacks actually switch targets in between cards, unlike how it normally works for you. Now, in that scenario, basically, we just say, oh, okay, the second attack randomly went to the second taunting unit and did kill that, and then the third action goes back to the first unit and also kills that. So all of those attacks basically end up getting used. And we have a little blurb here. It says, the way to think about taunts is that when it's on one unit, the skip happens because when a unit dies, it's still taunted. So this is what we mean by the order of operations. When a unit goes down, the taunt is still temporarily applying as the enemy is queuing up its next attack. It has no actual valid target though, thereby it eliminates all of its remaining actions for that turn. Like I said, this is a very abusable aspect for challenge environments. For 2 taunting units, then it differs because now it has 2 valid targets, so the taunt glitch doesn't immediately take effect. So remember, there's multiple scenarios. It could not kill with the first hit, or it could kill with each hit that it does, each action that it does, and then all of a sudden you notice, aha, you still got the taunt glitch and only the 3rd action was skipped instead of, basically the first 2, or sorry, the latter 2 actions for the enemy. So the switch can basically be random, and that just can happen mid-attacks. It doesn't really matter. It's not forced to attacking one unit then in that scenario. But this gets weirder because in FGO, we kind of have some unique interactions with Guts as well. You guys are aware of the fact that in a solo environment, at least, if your Guts gets popped, the enemy will cease acting. The reason for this is because, just like we mentioned with the taunt glitch, there is no valid target. So that's one of the scenarios that'll happen. But how does Guts and taunt interact with each other? So in this first scenario here, you guys can see we have one taunted unit that also has Guts. So the enemy action 1 will attack and trigger the taunted person's Guts, basically killing them in effect. But the enemy will get a second action. And the reason why, this was something that I was debating with Avalon right before this, and something I got him to test, is because if you were in a solo environment and you were the only, so you're the only unit on the field, and you are taunting, but you also have a Guts active, and the enemy kills you, the enemy will not take another action because there's no other valid target. If you're in a full team loadout though, and this happens, the enemy still can take another action. Why? Because there are other valid targets. It has allies. So instead of it immediately getting rid of its ability to act, it can all of a sudden queue up another attack, but the taunt will force it back still to the original target. So despite the order of operations working that way, this is how, for some of you that are a little bit more veteran, if you've ever noticed having Guts and taunt active, that all of a sudden an enemy will kind of double tap your Guts unit that is taunting, that's why. It's because you have somebody else in the party, it has another valid option, but the taunt redirects it back to the Guts unit. So that's a scenario you want to try to avoid. That will get your Guts unit killed at really no value to you. So be careful about doing Guts and taunt at the same time in that regard. In the second scenario, we basically have taunt and Guts, but the first attack doesn't trigger the taunt's Guts, the taunted unit's Guts. So basically, at that point, you have an environment where now it has a second action. It takes the second action. That does trigger the Guts. That will skip action number 3 in an AoE environment. We're not really sure why. It's just the thing kind of gets its stuff there. It gets at least 2 of its actions. And we talked about that. It says if Guts is in play, the enemy always has at least 2 out of 3 actions. If action 2 triggers the Guts, it'll skip action 3. It can't skip 2 actions even if 1 Guts triggers though. It'll always get at least 2. The only exception is, as we mentioned, if it's the only unit on the field, because it has no other valid target. So that will still trigger the Guts flash taunt glitch. So it is interesting. Now, there's also the enemy taunt scenario where 2 enemy units are taunted. You can switch targets mid-attack chain. So let's say you did like a mighty chain. You did QAB and it was a brave chain of one of your units. So you have all of their, like you have 3 of the same units cards, and you're going through. So you do QAB, but there's 2 enemies that are taunted. Q could go to enemy 1, A could go to enemy 2, and B could go back to enemy 1. That would be your issue there. Is normally, if you have a sequence chain like that, you cannot switch targets. But if there's multiple enemies that are taunting, that can occur. So this is what I described before, and that is an interesting thing. It's very niche, doesn't happen super often, but it can happen. And it can actually be used even on like CQs or some story fights to help in the case of like a time attack or a turn attack if you're trying to get the fight done as fast as possible. The example provided is Karen and Mango's CQ from the NA Valentine's Day. Also, Osaka Hime could be used to taunt potentially another unit. Now, this is weird because if the other unit is like let's say an enemy is already taunting you and you tried to taunt someone with Osaka Himes, you couldn't because you're already taunted, so it would just default back to the unit that was already taunting. But let's say you used Osaka Hime's skill to put taunt on somebody, and then on the enemy's turn, it taunted as well. That could potentially result in a multi-taunt scenario. There are currently 39 units in the game that have taunt. So it is a very available skill on units. It is difficult to get on craft essences, and there is no current way to get it on mystic codes. This means that the vast majority of your taunts are going to be unit-based solutions. The highest taunt value for the players on a skill is Leonidas, who has scalability from 100 to 500% on his first skill. So that's the highest percentage you can get off of that. Everybody else pretty much is 300% at max value. Some units have scalable taunt skills. Most units don't. It's usually the early game units that have scaling taunt. And they're usually base 100 and they go up to 300%. The highest taunt values off of a unit's Noble Phantasm is basically 500% from QSH, Bazette, and Leonidas, if he manages to get 500% overcharge, would also get 500% taunt value. However, that's not the highest taunt value in the game. The highest taunt value in the game is technically 1,000% from CEs. But also the lowest taunt value in the game is from CEs. Outrage only has 100%. So keep that in mind. Just taunt values do not matter in the vast majority of scenarios unless you're dealing with multiple taunts. But it could happen. So, let me know what you guys think about this. How do you guys feel about taunt glitch, guts glitch, and all of this? And did you like the explanations? I'll be curious to hear you guys' thoughts and curious to see how you guys use taunt in your favor in the future. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys for the next one. Later. Hey, if you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe, right? I'm gonna give you guys my black camera background. Unfortunately, chat, that means I've censored Lartoria's ass. I feel bad, but it is what it is.